"Mom, you've been getting confused lately. Maybe it's time I start handling things for you." That was the sentence my son chose, spoken casually over dinner like he was offering to pass the salt. And for a moment, the room didn't feel like mine anymore. I remember the soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock above the stove, the way the evening light fell across the table I had set with care, as I always did, even now, even after everything. Jason didn't look at me when he said it. He was focused on his plate, cutting his steak into careful, even pieces, as if what he had just said required no reaction at all. Lauren, sitting beside him, gave a small, almost sympathetic smile, the kind that might fool someone who didn't know better. I felt something shift inside me then, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet, precise movement, like a lock clicking into place. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't ask him what he meant, even though the implication hung heavy in the air between us. Instead, I picked up my glass of water, took a slow sip, and set it back down exactly where it had been before. "If that's what you think is best," I said, my voice steady, softer than I expected. Jason nodded, relieved, as if I had just confirmed something he had already decided. "It's just until things get easier for you," he added, finally glancing up, but only for a second. "You don't need to worry about bills or appointments or any of that anymore. I'll take care of it. Take care of it." The words sounded kind on the surface, but they carried weight, the kind that presses down slowly, almost politely, until you realize you can't breathe the same way anymore. Lauren reached over and touched his arm, her expression warm, encouraging. "We just want to make things simpler for you," she said. "Less stress." I nodded, because that's what they expected. Because arguing would have made me look exactly like what they were already suggesting I was. Confused, forgetful, vulnerable. I had seen this before, not in my own home, not with my own child, but enough to recognize the pattern. It never starts with something obvious. It starts with small changes. Offers of help that turn into decisions made. Without you. Questions that are answered for you before you can speak. Doors that are closed just a little sooner than they used to be. That night, after they left, I sat alone at the kitchen table long after the plates had been cleared. The house was quiet in a way that felt different now, heavier somehow. I looked around at the familiar details, the cabinet where I kept my bank statements, the drawer where my checkbook rested, the calendar on the wall filled with notes in my own handwriting. And for the first time, I understood that they were no longer just parts of my routine. They were about to become something else entirely. Evidence. I folded my hands in front of me and stared at the grain of the wood beneath my fingers. Jason thought I was slipping, that I wouldn't notice, that I would be grateful, even. And maybe that was the most surprising part of all. Not that he said it, but that he believed it. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath, the kind you take when you've just realized the rules of a game have changed without anyone telling you. Then I smiled, just a little, because there was one thing my son had gotten wrong. I wasn't confused. I was quiet. And there's a difference. I noticed the change the very next morning, not because anything dramatic happened, but because everything felt just slightly out of place, like someone had come into my home overnight and moved things an inch to the left. My coffee mug was not where I had left it on the counter. The mail that usually sat neatly by the front door was gone. Even the small notepad I kept beside the phone had been turned at an angle, as if someone else had used it and forgotten to put it back the way I liked. I stood there for a moment, holding the edge of the counter, letting my eyes move slowly from one detail to the next, and I realized this was how it would begin. Not with a confrontation, not with a single defining moment, but with a series of quiet adjustments that only I would notice. Jason arrived earlier than usual that day, just after 9 in the morning, his car pulling into the driveway with a kind of purpose that did not belong to a casual visit. He did not knock. He used his key. That was new. I heard the door open, the familiar sound of footsteps crossing the hardwood floor, and then his voice, light, almost cheerful. "Morning, Mom. I figured I would stop by and help you get organized." I turned to face him, offering a small smile, the same one I had practiced the night before. "That is kind of you," I said, keeping my tone even. He glanced around the kitchen, his eyes moving quickly, taking inventory in a way that felt more like assessment than concern. "We are going to make things easier for you," he continued. "Less clutter, fewer things to keep track of." Lauren followed him in a few minutes later, carrying a tote bag and a tablet, her movements efficient, her expression calm. "I brought a few things that might help," she said, setting the bag on the table as if she belonged there. I watched as she began pulling out folders, labels, and a small stack of documents, arranging them in front of me without asking. Jason moved to the counter and picked up my mail, flipping through it with practiced ease. "I will handle these from now on," he said. "Bills, statements, anything important. You do not need to worry about missing something." I nodded again, because that was what they expected, but inside, I felt the quiet tightening of something that had once been loose and familiar. He was not asking. He was informing. Lauren tapped on her tablet, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. "We can also consolidate your accounts," she added. "It will make everything simpler. One place, one login, one system. Jason can monitor it for you." Monitor. Another word that sounded helpful if you did not listen too closely. I sat down at the table, folding my hands in my lap, watching as my life was slowly translated into categories and checklists. Jason pulled out my chair slightly, as if guiding me into place. "We're just trying to take some of the pressure off," he said, his voice softening in a way that might have sounded reassuring to anyone else. "You have done enough, Mom. Let us take it from here." I looked up at him then, really looked, and for a brief second, I saw something flicker across his face. Not cruelty, not even malice, just certainty. The kind that comes from believing you are right, from believing that what you are doing is justified. That made it harder, in a way, because it meant he would not question himself. He would not stop unless something forced him to. Lauren slid a document toward me, her pen resting neatly on top of it. "This is just a basic authorization form," she said gently. "It allows Jason to speak on your behalf if needed. Nothing complicated. Nothing complicated." I glanced down at the paper without touching it, letting my eyes skim the lines without truly reading them. I did not need to. I already understood what it was meant to do. I reached for the pen, feeling its weight in my hand, and then paused, just long enough to make it look like hesitation, not refusal. "If it helps," I said quietly. Jason smiled, relieved again, and in that moment, I realized something important. They were watching for resistance, for signs that I might push back, that I might question what was happening. And as long as I did not, as long as I remained calm, agreeable, and just a little slower than before, they would keep moving forward, convinced that they were in control. I lowered my gaze and set the pen back down without signing, letting my hand rest beside it as if I had simply forgotten what I was about to do. Lauren did not notice. Jason did not notice. They were already talking about the next step, the next change, the next small adjustment that would bring them closer to what they wanted. I sat there, listening, nodding when appropriate, allowing the morning to unfold exactly as they intended, because the more they believed I was slipping, the less they would see what I was actually doing. And for the first time since that dinner, I understood the shape of it, not just what they were trying to take, but how they planned to take it, one quiet decision at a time. I began to understand that control does not arrive all at once. It settles in slowly, like dust, almost invisible until you notice how much is gathered. And by the third day, my house no longer felt like a place I moved through freely, but something closer to a place where I was being quietly managed. Jason started coming by every morning, always around the same time, always with that same tone of casual purpose, as if this had always been part of his routine, as if he had always been the one in charge. He would walk in without knocking, set his keys on the counter, and immediately begin adjusting things, straightening papers, moving items, checking drawers, his presence filling the space in a way that left very little room for mine. Lauren did not come every day, but when she did, she brought that same careful efficiency with her, her tablet in hand, her notes already prepared, her voice calm and measured as she suggested changes that were never really suggestions. "We updated your calendar," she said one afternoon, turning the screen toward me. "Now everything is synced. Doctor appointments, bill due dates, reminders. Jason will get notifications too, just in case." Just in case. I repeated the phrase silently, letting it settle, noticing how often it appeared in their language, how it softened every decision that was being taken out of my hands. I walked into the living room later that evening and paused when I saw my checkbook was no longer in the drawer where I had kept it for over 15 years. It was a small thing, easy to overlook if you were not paying attention, but I had learned to pay attention. I opened the drawer again, slowly, as if it might appear if I gave it enough time, but of course it did not. Jason noticed me standing there and smiled, a reassuring expression that did not quite reach his eyes. "I moved it," he said. "It is safer if I keep track of it. You do not need to worry about writing checks anymore." I nodded, because that was the role I had chosen to play, the one that allowed them to continue without suspicion. "That makes sense," I said quietly, closing the drawer as if nothing had been lost. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table again, the same place where everything had begun to shift, and I noticed something else. My mail was no longer arriving the way it used to. Important envelopes were missing, replaced by brief summaries Jason would mention in passing. "I took care of your electric bill," he said one morning, not looking up from his phone. There was a statement from the bank, but it was nothing you needed to see. Nothing I needed to see. I let the words pass without reaction, but inside, they stayed with me, precise and sharp. This was no longer about helping. This was about filtering my world, deciding what I was allowed to know and what could be handled without me. Lauren began organizing the kitchen next, labeling containers, rearranging cabinets, explaining each change as if she were doing me a favor. "It will be easier for you this way," she said, placing items at eye level, moving others out of reach, simplifying, reducing, controlling. I watched her hands move through my space, efficient and confident, and I realized she was not just helping Jason. She was guiding him, shaping the way he saw this situation, reinforcing the idea that I was someone who needed to be managed. That night, as I turned off the lights and walked slowly down the hallway, I felt the weight of it more clearly than before. Every small change, every missing item, every decision made without me was part of something larger, something deliberate. They were not rushing. They were building a case, step by step, until the version of me they were creating would be easier to believe than the one I knew myself to be. I paused at the doorway to my bedroom, resting my hand lightly against the frame, and allowed myself a moment to think it through completely. They believed I was losing control. They believed they were stepping in to fix it. And because of that, they were not hiding what they were doing. They were showing me, piece by piece, trusting that I would not understand what it meant. I stepped inside, closed the door behind me, and let the quiet settle again, steady and familiar. Then I sat down at the edge of the bed, folded my hands in my lap, and began to put those pieces together, not as they intended, but as they truly were, because the more they rearranged my life, the clearer their pattern became, and the closer I came to knowing exactly when and how to stop them. I woke up before the sun the next morning, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my mind had already begun sorting through everything they had changed, every drawer opened, every document moved, every quiet decision made in my absence, and for the first time in years, I did not reach for the day ahead, I reached backward instead. I stood in the hallway for a moment, my hand resting lightly on the wall, and I let myself remember this house the way it used to feel, not as a place being managed, but as something I had built piece by piece with my own hands and my own choices. There was a time when every bill on that counter had passed through my fingers first, when every account had my name at the center of it, when every decision, big or small, had been mine to make or mine to share. I moved slowly into the living room, my steps quiet, my eyes tracing the familiar shapes of furniture that had not changed, even if the meaning behind them had. The armchair by the window, the one I had chosen after weeks of searching, still sat in the same place, but it no longer felt like a seat of rest. It felt like something observed, like a marker of where I was expected to be. I sat down anyway, folding my hands together, and let the memories come without resistance. I remembered the years after my husband passed, how I had learned to handle everything alone, how I had sat at this very table with stacks of paperwork, teaching myself what I needed to know, making sure nothing slipped through the cracks. There had been no confusion then, no hesitation, just a steady rhythm of responsibility that I carried without question. I remembered Jason as a boy, sitting across from me, his homework spread out, his questions simple, his trust complete. I had been the one he turned to for answers, for guidance, for reassurance that things would be all right. I had been the one in control, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that held everything together quietly, reliably, without needing to be acknowledged. That memory stayed with me as I stood and walked toward the kitchen, where the changes were more obvious, more deliberate. The labeled containers, the reorganized shelves, the absence of certain things I had always kept within reach. I opened a cabinet and paused, noticing how items had been placed at different heights, how some had been moved further back, just enough to make them less accessible. It was subtle, almost thoughtful, but it carried a message all the same. This is not yours to manage anymore. I closed the cabinet gently and moved to the counter, where the stack of papers Lauren had arranged still sat in perfect order. I did not touch them. Not yet. Instead, I let my eyes move over them slowly, recognizing the structure they had created, the categories, the divisions, the quiet redefinition of my life into something that could be organized and controlled by someone else. I thought about the way Jason had spoken, the certainty in his voice, the ease with which he had stepped into a role he had never held before. He did not see this as taking something from me. He saw it as correcting something, as stepping in where he believed I had begun to fall short. That belief was the foundation of everything they were doing, and it was what made it so effective. Because if I resisted, if I pushed back too soon, it would only confirm what they were already suggesting, that I was not thinking clearly, that I was making things harder than they needed to be. I walked back into the hallway and stopped in front of the small framed photograph that hung near the staircase, a picture of Jason and me taken years ago, both of us smiling, both of us certain of who we were to each other. I studied it for a long moment, not with sadness, but with a kind of quiet clarity that had not been there before. People change, I thought, but sometimes the change is not in who they are, it is in what they believe they are allowed to do. I reached up and straightened the frame, a small adjustment, almost instinctive, and then let my hand fall back to my side. They believed I was losing my grip on things, that I was slipping into something uncertain and fragile. But what they did not understand was that I had spent years building a life that required attention, patience, and control, and those things do not disappear overnight. They settle, they wait, they observe. I turned away from the photograph and walked toward the kitchen again, my steps steady now, my thoughts no longer scattered but aligned, because the more I remembered who I had been, the clearer it became who I still was, and more importantly, who I would need to be next, not louder, not angrier, but sharper, quieter, and far more deliberate than they expected. I did not expect the moment to come so quietly, but it did, on an ordinary afternoon when the light fell across the kitchen table just the same as it had every day before, and that was what made it so clear. I had just finished making tea, the kettle still warm in my hand, when I noticed the envelope. It was not where it should have been, and that alone was enough to stop me. It sat slightly tucked beneath a stack of neatly arranged papers Lauren had left behind, its corner just visible, as if it had been placed there deliberately, but not carefully enough to disappear completely. I set the kettle down without making a sound and reached for it slowly, sliding it free from the stack with the same measured movement I had been using for everything lately. My name was on the front, printed in the familiar format of my bank, the kind I had received for years without ever giving it a second thought. But I had not seen this one arrive. I had not been told about it. That was the first thing that mattered. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of it, the thickness of the paper inside, and for a moment, I simply stood there, letting the silence settle around me. Then I opened it. The letter inside was brief, formal, and precise. It referenced changes to my account, adjustments to access permissions, confirmations of updates that had been processed recently, changes I had not made, permissions I had not granted, updates I had not even known were happening. I read each line carefully, not once, but twice, letting the meaning settle in fully, without rushing past it, without allowing myself to react too quickly. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not something that had slipped through by accident. This was documentation. Official, recorded, and accepted. I lowered the paper slightly and looked around the kitchen, at the clean surfaces, the organized shelves, the quiet order that had been created around me, and I understood something with a clarity that did not need explanation. They were not just preparing to take control. They had already begun. Jason had not waited. He had not asked. He had moved forward, step by step, confident that I would either agree or fail to notice. I folded the letter carefully along its original crease and slid it back into the envelope, my movements steady, deliberate, unchanged from the outside. There was no reason to rush now. If anything, rushing would only disrupt the pattern they believed they had established. I placed the envelope back where I had found it, tucking it just slightly further beneath the papers, making it look untouched, unseen. Then I returned to my chair at the table and sat down, wrapping my hands around the mug of tea that had already begun to cool. I did not drink it. I simply held it there, letting the warmth fade slowly against my palms as I considered what I now knew. They had access to my accounts. They were making changes in my name. And most importantly, they believed they could continue without being questioned. That belief was their greatest advantage, and it would also become their greatest mistake. I leaned back slightly in my chair and allowed myself a small breath, not of shock, not of anger, but of confirmation. The pattern I had been watching was real. The pieces I had been collecting were not coincidences. They were part of a plan that had already moved beyond intention and into action. I set the mug down gently and looked toward the window, where the afternoon light had begun to shift, stretching longer across the floor. Time was moving forward, just as it always did, but now it felt measured, intentional, something to be used rather than simply passed through. I would not confront them. Not yet. Confrontation would give them the chance to adjust, to explain, to tighten whatever they had already put in place. No, what I needed now was something else. Information, timing, precision. I stood up slowly, smoothing my hand along the edge of the table as I did, and walked toward the hallway with the same careful pace I had adopted since all of this began. From the outside, nothing had changed. The house was still quiet. The routine was still intact. But inside, something had shifted completely. They had made their move. And now, finally, I knew exactly where to begin. The next step did not begin with a confrontation or even a plan written down in neat, careful lines. It began with something much smaller, something almost invisible, a decision to move differently through my own life without letting anyone see that I had changed at all. The following morning, when Jason arrived at exactly 9:12, as he had the day before, I was already sitting at the kitchen table with my hands folded and a crossword puzzle spread out in front of me, the pencil resting loosely between my fingers as if I had been working on it for some time. He stepped inside without knocking, his routine now as predictable as the ticking clock on the wall, and he glanced at me with that same assessing look before setting his keys down on the counter. "Morning, Mom," he said, his tone light, practiced. "Did you sleep all right?" I looked up at him, allowing a brief pause, just long enough to seem uncertain. "I think so," I replied softly. "I keep losing track of the nights." It was not entirely untrue, but the way I said it mattered more than the words themselves. Jason nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already decided. "That is okay," he said. "That is why I am here." Lauren arrived a few minutes later, her presence as composed as ever, her tablet already in her hands, her attention divided between the screen and the room. "We should go over the accounts again today," she said, not to me, but to Jason, as if I were a detail in the background rather than the center of the discussion. I lowered my gaze back to the crossword, filling in a word I already knew, allowing them to speak without interruption. "I can take you to the bank later this week," Jason continued, "just to make sure everything is set up properly." I hesitated again, letting my pencil hover above the page. "If you think that is best," I said, my voice quiet, uncertain in just the right way. He smiled, satisfied, and in that moment, I saw it clearly. The more I stepped back, the more he stepped forward. The more I appeared unsure, the more confident he became. It was a simple exchange, almost natural, and that was what made it effective. Over the next hour, they moved through the house as they always did, adjusting, organizing, deciding. Lauren made notes, Jason handled the mail, and I remained where I was, present but not participating, listening without appearing to listen. Every word they spoke added to the picture I was building. Every assumption they made filled in another detail. When Jason mentioned the bank again, this time more specifically, I felt a quiet sense of confirmation settle into place. "We will finalize everything," he said. "It will be easier that way. Finalize everything." I repeated the phrase silently, letting it anchor itself in my mind. That was what they believed they were moving toward. That was the moment they were preparing for. And that was where I would meet them. Later that afternoon, after they had left, I did something I had not done in days. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I had not needed to use in years. Edward Grant answered on the second ring, his voice steady, familiar, unchanged by time. "Margaret Collins," he said, a note of recognition in his tone. "It has been a while." I allowed myself a small breath before responding. "Yes," I said. "It has. I need to review a few things." I did not explain everything. Not yet. I did not need to. Edward had known me long enough to understand that when I called, it was not without reason. We arranged a meeting for later in the week, quiet, private, without unnecessary attention. When I hung up the phone, I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence of the house again. But this time, it felt different. Not heavy, not uncertain, but focused. I returned to the kitchen and looked at the table where Lauren's folders still sat, perfectly aligned, each one representing a piece of the control they believed they were establishing. I reached out and adjusted one of them slightly, just enough to feel the edge of the paper beneath my fingers, then let my hand fall back to my side. They thought they were guiding this process, shaping it, directing it toward an outcome they had already imagined. But they had made one mistake. They believed I was no longer capable of seeing the full picture. And because of that, they would not be prepared for what came next. By the time the day of the meeting approached, everything in the house had settled into a rhythm that no longer felt accidental, and that was exactly what made it useful. Jason arrived at the same time each morning, spoke in the same calm, measured tone, and moved through each room with the same quiet authority he believed he had earned. Lauren followed with her lists and her tablet, refining details, smoothing edges, turning what they were doing into something that looked organized, reasonable, even necessary. And I remained consistent, just as they expected, just as they needed me to be. I moved a little slower. I asked for clarification on simple things. I allowed small pauses to stretch just long enough to suggest uncertainty without ever crossing into contradiction. It was a careful balance, one that required attention, but I had spent a lifetime paying attention to far more complicated things. "Do you remember where we put your insurance documents?" Jason asked one morning, his voice light, but his eyes watchful. I looked at the cabinet, then back at him, letting a moment pass. "I think so," I said, though I did not move to retrieve them. He stepped in immediately, opening the cabinet himself, pulling out the folder before I could even stand. "It is okay," he said, almost gently. "I have it." Of course he did. That was the point. Every question they asked was no longer about finding an answer. It was about confirming that I would not provide one, that they would need to. And each time I allowed that to happen, their confidence grew. They spoke more freely now, less cautious than before, their conversations drifting into plans that were no longer disguised as suggestions. "Once everything is finalized, it will be much easier," Lauren said one afternoon, her tone practical, assured. "We can streamline all of it." I nodded, as I always did, my expression calm, my hands resting quietly in my lap. Streamline. Another word that carried more weight than it appeared to. It meant reduction. It meant removal. It meant control. That evening, after they left, I prepared for the next step in the only way that made sense. I gathered what I needed, not in a rush, not with any sign of urgency, but with the same steady pace I had used for everything else. Old statements that had not yet disappeared. Notes I had written down over the past few days, small observations, dates, phrases, changes. Nothing dramatic, just enough to form a pattern. Enough to show movement. Enough to show intent. I placed everything into a simple folder and set it aside, out of sight, but not out of reach. The following morning, when Jason mentioned the bank again, more firmly this time, I responded the same way I always had. "If you think that is best," I said quietly. He smiled, satisfied, already moving forward in his mind. "Good," he replied. "We will go tomorrow. I will take care of everything." I lowered my gaze slightly, as if relieved to have the decision made for me. And in that moment, I knew we had reached the point they had been working toward. This was not preparation anymore. This was execution. They believed the outcome was already certain, that all that remained was the final step, the formalization of what they had been building piece by piece. Later that day, I received a brief confirmation from Edward Grant. The meeting was set. The timing aligned. Everything was in place. I read the message once, then set the phone down without any visible reaction, letting the quiet of the house settle around me once again. Outside, the light was beginning to fade, stretching long shadows across the floor, marking the end of one day and the beginning of something else entirely. I stood in the center of the room for a moment, taking in the space as it was now, organized, adjusted, subtly altered in ways that would not have been noticed by anyone who had not lived here as long as I had. Then I turned toward the hallway and walked slowly toward my room, my steps steady, my thoughts clear, because by now, there was nothing left to question. They had built their version of the truth carefully, methodically, believing that I would accept it without resistance. And tomorrow, they would expect me to sign it into place. I reached the doorway and paused, my hand resting lightly against the frame, the same way it had before, but this time, there was no uncertainty left, no hesitation to consider. Only timing, only precision, only the quiet understanding that everything they had done had led them exactly where I needed them to be. The morning of the meeting arrived without ceremony, without tension, without anything that would suggest the weight of what was about to happen, and that was exactly how I needed it to be. Jason pulled into the driveway at 9:10, 2 minutes earlier than usual, his timing just slightly sharper, his movements just a little more focused, and I could see it in the way he stepped out of the car that he believed this day mattered. He knocked once, out of habit more than necessity, then opened the door before I could reach it, carrying that same quiet confidence with him as he crossed the threshold. "Ready, Mom?" he asked, his tone steady, reassuring, as if we were heading towards something simple, something already decided. I picked up my purse from the table, the same purse I had used for years, and nodded gently. "If you think that is best," I replied, letting the words fall into place exactly as they had before. Lauren was already waiting in the car, her posture straight, her tablet resting neatly on her lap, her expression calm and prepared. As we drove, the conversation stayed light, controlled, centered on logistics rather than meaning. Jason spoke about parking, about timing, about how quick the process would be once we arrived. Lauren added small confirmations, details about documents, signatures, next steps. I listened, nodding when expected, allowing the rhythm to continue uninterrupted. When we reached the office, Edward Grant was already there, standing near the entrance, his presence quiet but unmistakable. Jason greeted him politely, unaware of anything beyond the surface, unaware of the alignment that had already been set in place. "Thank you for meeting with us," Jason said, extending his hand. Edward nodded, his expression neutral, professional. "Of course," he replied. "Please, come in." The room was simple, orderly, nothing dramatic, nothing designed to unsettle, just a table, a few chairs, and a stack of documents waiting neatly at the center. Jason guided me to my seat, pulling the chair out slightly, positioning me as he had done before, his gestures careful, controlled. Lauren sat beside him, her attention already on the papers, her pen ready. "We just need to go through a few things," Jason said, sliding a document toward me. "Nothing complicated." I looked down at the page, letting my eyes move slowly across the lines without reacting, without revealing anything beyond what they expected to see. "Take your time," Lauren added, her voice soft, encouraging. I let a pause settle, long enough to feel natural, then lifted my gaze. Slightly, not to Jason, not to Lauren, but to Edward. It was a small shift, almost unnoticeable if you were not watching closely, but it changed the direction of the room entirely. Edward stepped forward, placing his hand lightly on the table. "Before we proceed," he said calmly, "there are a few things we need to clarify." Jason frowned slightly, his confidence interrupted but not yet shaken. "Clarify," he repeated. Edward nodded, his tone steady, measured. "Yes. Regarding recent changes to Mrs. Collins' accounts and the authorization process that has been initiated." The words settled into the space between us, quiet but precise, and for the first time, Jason's expression shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. Lauren's hand paused above the page, her pen no longer moving. I remained still, my hands resting in my lap, my posture unchanged, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. Edward reached for a folder and opened it, revealing a set of documents that did not come from Jason, did not come from Lauren, but from a different source entirely. "We have reviewed the records," he continued, "and there are discrepancies that require explanation." Jason glanced at Lauren, then back at Edward, his certainty beginning to thin. "I was helping my mother," he said, his voice still controlled, but no longer effortless. Edward nodded once. "That is what we are here to discuss," he replied. I looked down at the document in front of me again, the one Jason had placed there, the one he expected me to sign without question, and I did not touch it. Instead, I let my gaze rest there, steady, unchanged, while the room shifted around me. For days, They had spoken for me, decided for me, moved through my life as if I were no longer capable of understanding it. And now, without raising my voice, without changing my posture, without doing anything more than allowing the truth to surface, I had taken that space back. Jason leaned back slightly in his chair, his hand no longer guiding, no longer directing, his control slipping not through confrontation, but through exposure. Lauren said nothing, her composure holding, but her stillness revealing more than any words could. Edward closed the folder gently and looked toward me, not with instruction, not with expectation, but with acknowledgement. I met his gaze for a brief moment, then lowered my eyes again, returning to the quiet, composed presence I had maintained from the beginning. They had believed this moment would finalize everything, that it would confirm their version of the truth, that it would place the last piece exactly where they wanted it. But instead, it had done something else entirely. It had revealed who had been in control all along. Jason did not speak for a long moment after Edward finished, and that silence said more than anything he could have offered in defense, because for the first time since this began, he was no longer ahead of the conversation, no longer guiding it, no longer certain of where it would lead. He looked at the documents again, then at Lauren, as if searching for something familiar to hold on to, but the structure they had built so carefully was no longer steady. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said finally, his voice controlled but thinner than before. Edward did not interrupt him. He simply waited. "I was helping her," Jason continued, gesturing lightly in my direction, though he did not quite meet my eyes. "She has been forgetting things. I thought it would be better if I handled the accounts, just to make sure everything was taken care of. Better. Taken care of." The same words, the same reasoning, but now they sounded different in this room, under this light, with everything laid out clearly in front of us. Edward nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "Intentions aside," he said evenly, "authority cannot be assumed. It must be granted, clearly, and without ambiguity." The words settled with precision, leaving very little room for interpretation. Lauren shifted slightly in her seat, her composure still intact, but her confidence no longer as effortless as it had been. "We were trying to simplify things," she added, her tone measured, careful, "to reduce stress." I listened without reacting, my hands still resting quietly in my lap, my posture unchanged, because this was not the moment for explanation or emotion. It was the moment for clarity. Edward closed the folder in front of him and turned his attention fully to me. "Mrs. Collins," he said, his voice steady, respectful, "do you wish to grant this level of control over your financial and personal affairs?" The room became very still then, not because the question was unexpected, but because of what it required. A direct answer, a clear statement, no interpretation, no assumption, no quiet adjustment. I lifted my gaze slowly, first to Edward, then to Jason, allowing just enough time for the shift to be felt, for the difference between before and now to settle into place. Jason watched me closely, his expression uncertain in a way I had not seen before, as if he was trying to reconcile the version of me he had constructed with the one sitting in front of him now. I did not raise my voice. I did not change my tone. "No," I said simply. The word was quiet, but it did not need to be anything else. It was clear. It was complete. It was mine. Jason's shoulders tightened slightly, his reaction controlled but visible, and for a moment, he looked as though he might speak again, might try to reframe, to explain, to regain something of what had just been lost. But there was nothing left to adjust, nothing left to manage. Edward nodded once, making a small note on the document in front of him, the motion calm, procedural, final. "Then we will proceed accordingly," he said. The rest of the meeting moved quickly after that, not rushed, but efficient, each step clear, each decision documented, each boundary re-established in a way that left no room for interpretation. Access was reviewed. Permissions were corrected. Future changes were outlined, not as possibilities, but as requirements that would only occur with my direct approval. I remained present through all of it, listening, confirming, answering when needed, not as someone being guided, but as someone fully aware of every detail being discussed. When it was finished, I gathered my purse and stood up, my movement steady, unchanged from the beginning, but the space around me felt different now, not because anything physical had shifted, but because the understanding had. Jason stood as well, slower this time, his usual certainty replaced by something quieter, something more cautious. "Mom," he began, his voice softer now, uncertain in a way that would have been unfamiliar just hours before. I met his gaze briefly, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something simpler. Recognition. "You said I was confused," I replied, my tone even, my words measured. I paused just long enough for them to settle. I was only quiet. I did not wait for a response. I did not need one. I turned and walked toward the door, my steps unhurried, my posture steady, leaving the room exactly as I had entered it, composed, deliberate, and fully in control of everything that mattered.